Okay, so let's just get started then as we're recording. And I'm just going to make sure there we go, there's my form. All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to this peer-to-peer chat. My name is Rachel Marks, and I'm the Executive Director of Rezo SPARC Network. I'm joining you today from what is currently referred to as Leeds and Grenville County, but is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. I am approximately 60 kilometers northeast of Cataraqui, which is Kingston, Ontario. This area is covered under the Crawford Purchase of 1783, an unlawful purchase agreement that engulfed land that it should not have, and that has left the Algonquin people struggling to reclaim their land ever since. Today, we have the privilege of joining together virtually and using technology that is steeped in colonial mindset and that continues to marginalize Indigenous communities around the province. The need for better access to internet and technology in our Indigenous communities is ongoing and something that we should all address. Tonight, I am so excited to introduce a wonderful colleague and friend, Juan Jaramillo. Juan is a deaf Colombian-Canadian artistic director, writer, dancer, and performance artist whose work celebrates deaf culture, identity, and accessibility in the arts. As the founder and artistic director of Dancing Hands Theatre, Juan has dedicated over 30 years to developing and performing ASL dance and musical interpretation, transforming movement and sign language into powerful forms of visual storytelling. His work explores the intersection of language, culture, and identity, bridging communities through performances that honor the richness of the deaf experience. Juan has received this past year, the Christine Karcza Disability Leadership Award and a Dora Mavor Moore Award nomination for Outstanding New Play, recognizing his leadership and creative contributions to inclusive theater. Hi, Juan. Also,
Hello. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
I just wanted to also point out for anyone that we have TK who's interpreting for Juan this evening and for us this evening. So hi to TK as well. And if you have questions during the chat, please use the raise hand function on Zoom as a great visual reminder for all of us that you have a question. Okay, Juan, I'm going to pass this over to you now. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me here. Hi there, everyone. I mean, really, tonight is chill. Tonight, we're just going to go with the flow. I have a couple of things that we're going to look at and talk about tonight. But if you have any questions, just like Rachel mentioned, just raise your hand and we're going to get this done. So, as Rachel said, now just to let you know, I have many hats and I have many roles. And it's been that way for as long as I can remember. I also have a richness of experience. But tonight, the main hat that I'm wearing and the main topic of my presentation is when it comes to accessibility in the ASL, American Sign Language space, specifically in theater, what does that mean? So, really, in terms of the part of this discussion, I mean, I could go on for many, many hours. I could go as deep as I could, but just for the purposes of tonight, I've just taken a couple key points just to share with everyone. So I'm just going to confirm that I can share my screen. So just 1 second. Appreciate your patience. So it says sharing, but I'm not seeing it. There we go. Okay, are we able to see that? So I see myself, but I am quite small. I'm just trying to figure out how to make my own screen bigger. There we go. So right now, I just want to confirm everyone sees the same thing I do. There's Director of Artistic Sign Language, DASL, and then Artistic Sign Language Lead, ASLL. So we're gonna hold that thought for now. But as was mentioned, I am a deaf actor, a deaf performer, a deaf writer, director, and I've also done quite a lot of work on the front lines. And in those experiences I've had on the front line of the theater world, I've noticed there have been a lot of barriers to accessibility when it comes to access through American Sign Language. When talking with colleagues and talking about people in the industry, we've been trying to figure out when it comes to work in the theater space, what are the best practices or approaches? So, really briefly, we have professionals working as interpreters, and their work often does not exist in theater spaces. They might work in the academic school system, in a medical system, the legal system, in the courts. And so oftentimes that will be where professional ASL English interpreters work. And there are a number of different processes and rules and things that exist in those spaces, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the differences and how those manifest in the theater space. So in the other spaces, it is important to know that when you work with an interpreter and you book an appointment or something with them, it's important if it's in a theater setting that the interpreter themselves as a person does have theater experience. That is going to make the process much smoother. Now, as you see on the screen, when we talk about the Director of Artistic Sign Language, I'll abbreviate that as a DASL. I know there have been many roles. There are ASL consultants, ASL coaches, DTI, deaf theater interpreters. And so there have been a lot of various roles that have already been used in the theater space. But over the last little while, primarily in the US, there have been discussions about these two newer roles. The first is the DASL, Director of Artistic Sign Language. And the same idea is what would maybe traditionally be referred to as an ASL coach. They would support with the writing, support with mentoring in terms of American Sign Language. And so that professional is a deaf individual who does hands-on work and has an approach making sure that the ASL, they focus on how it is shaped in the life of the story. And so they provide support to the team in terms of accommodating accessibility in the space through ASL. They would discuss in terms of working with interpreters, whereas the director of artistic sign language mentors and supports the interpreters, and sometimes they may also work with a hearing director. So you would have both a non-deaf director, a hearing director, and a deaf director working in the same space. So the director of artistic sign language is somebody to make sure that that all works seamlessly together. The second role is the Artistic Sign Language Lead, an ASLL. And what's interesting is that in past discussions, sometimes there would be some interpreters and some deaf actors, but they might have someone doing interpreting work. They're a deaf individual, and they've also done acting work, and they would never be identified as an interpreter because they may not have those formal competencies like I talked about before, people working either as a deaf interpreter in a medical space or an academic space. From that kind of middle space, a deaf actor or a deaf person with theater experience that doesn't interpret in other contexts. We also had deaf theater interpreters, but for those people like myself working in those spaces, we felt like calling ourselves interpreter didn't really fit what we did. We tried using other terms like deaf artist, deaf performer, deaf mentor, ASL actor, and so we've been trying to avoid using the word interpreter to describe the work that we do. So from those conversations, we've developed this newer term, the artistic sign language lead. And so really what that means is it's not actual interpreting, it's taking information and trying to find a way to have this nice blending of American Sign Language into the actual art that's being done, a way to blend those two things together. Again, in terms of deaf interpreters, professionals usually working in those medical, legal, or educational spaces, sometimes we find that their role doesn't lend itself to working in a theater space. There are limitations on how they can use the language. And so, for me, in my work, the challenge is looking to find somebody who's flexible enough to make some of those accommodations and artistic licenses that need to be done in a theater space. Does that make sense so far? Like, hoping everyone's still with me. So,
Yes.
okay, great. Perfect. So, I'm just going to change what's on my screen. Just one moment. Okay, so you're still just seeing the old information. Just one second. It works? Yep, okay. So this slide deck was developed, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. I've been using it a lot in the different presentations I've been giving. It just has a little bit more visual approach to it. So this again demonstrates four different things that we're looking at, or four different kinds of professionals you could work with when you're giving interpretation. So these are four different approaches to theater interpretation. The first one is called ASL theater interpreting, and that is very traditional interpretation. Maybe you're having a meeting connected to theater. Maybe you're having a discussion about contracts, just a general meeting where there's not any actual live acting happening. You can use a regular ASL English interpreter, just a standard interpreter. Doesn't matter whether or not it's a group setting. It doesn't matter if they have experience interpreting into the theater world. That doesn't matter because the expectation of that interpreter isn't to take on any acting or acting-esque role. Usually that work would be done for an hour or two. Let's say there was a presentation given to an audience. Then, if you look at number two, the deaf theater interpreter, that contrasts the work that a deaf interpreter would do in an educational context, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But just sticking on number one, ASL theater interpreting, that usually would be one interpreter or two interpreters when they are interpreting a non-presentation or a non-theatrical presentation. So let's say, for example, usually you would have 1 to 2 interpreters for an hour for a 2-hour shift. But again, it depends on the depth of the content that's being discussed. Looking at number two, when you're on the stage or delivering information on the stage, you might have a group of hearing actors, a hearing cast, as you see in the photo. This is an example of the Wizard of Oz. So you have the four characters, the four hearing actors. You have the Cowardly Lion, the Scarecrow, you have Dorothy, and you have the Tin Man. And off to the side, the two people who are dressed all in black are deaf theater interpreters, but now we would call those ASL leads or artistic sign language leads. So the ASLL from my first set of slides. You might have the four characters divided where each of the ASLLs takes two of those characters. And then you also have hearing interpreters who are seated in the front. So those are hearing interpreters with experience in theater, and they are working in tandem with the ASLLs. So those hearing interpreters who are seated in the front are providing the cues and following along in the script. So I, as a deaf theater interpreter or ASLL, would watch the interpretation that's delivered by the hearing interpreter in the front row, and I would then reinterpret or revitalize it in a more artistic way so that you get the full performance and content of what those hearing characters are saying. Usually, you'll try to have a team where it's two of each kind of interpreter. So regardless of what is happening in the stage, they may have a lot of movement, but the deaf and hearing interpreters would work off to the side. For me, as a deaf audience member, that then makes me play visual ping pong. I have to look to one side of the stage to see what's happening with the actors and their gestations or their gestures, and the other is taking in the interpretation. So I can't actually get the full image of what's happening visually, seeing what the actors are doing, but then I also can't take in the full interpretation. I have to pick. And so that visually can be quite stressful. That can be a lot of difficulty and a lot of strain on the eyes because I am constantly playing catch up, especially in a more dynamic scene when there's a lot of overlapping speech, when there's a lot of movement or a lot of blocking happening on stage. Those complicated scenes don't lend itself to this form of interpretation. It's quite challenging. There are pros and cons. It does do the job, but it's not the preference of the larger deaf community, the larger deaf audience that you're serving. Generally, that would require 3 to 4 weeks in advance. And the reason for that is because each of those interpreters needs time to read and review the script, just in the same way that the actors have to memorize the script and what their character is doing. And it's also an opportunity for the total interpreting team, so the ASLs, as well as the interpreters, to work together to figure out how they're going to cue each other, how everything works to make sure that it's a seamless process. So for that kind of booking, I would suggest 3 to 4 weeks in advance. And of course, if you have a lot of different characters, then that might need more lead time for the booking. But again, the director of artistic sign language or the director of ASL would be able to be that resource to support you in terms of the specific booking needs you may have. For that, you can also have deaf theater interpreters or ASLLs in terms of providing them a Zoom rehearsal or giving them access to maybe an archival so that they're able to see the movements as well as how the lines are delivered. And that would be done in that 3 to 4 weeks in advance. Just checking in on the interpreter. Doing okay? Yeah. I know I have a lot of content, so just let me know if I need to change my pace. Okay. All right, the next approach. Oh, yep, I see Rachel. You have a question?
Yes, please. I'm wondering in if I'm doing a dance performance and the host is giving, say, a 10-minute introduction, would your preference be for number one or number two? Should we have a should we have a deaf artist on stage with a hearing interpreter in the audience? Is that the preferred way?
So just for the introduction, kind of like the opening comments, I think that could just be a normal hearing interpreter. That would just be standard interpreter.
Okay.
So if they're just kind of introducing themselves, you would just have the standard interpreter. Uh, so a hearing interpreter could sign that, or a deaf interpreter could sign that as well. So you don't necessarily need to do a lot of accommodations to that. If you want, you could have the hearing presenter just kind of introduce themselves, or sorry. Yeah. Okay, so just to clarify, does the dance performance include any voice comments, or is it just the opening comments at the beginning?
So usually it's just the opening comments at the beginning. On a very rare occasion, there might be a few words throughout the performance, but very rare.
So I would say for that, you can just use the standard ASL English, like a hearing interpreter. It's very short. There's no actual artistic information being delivered. The dance itself is visual, and so you don't necessarily need interpretation for that. But sometimes the interpreter error, that was Tiki's error. Sometimes the dancer may be using their voice during the presentation or during their dance, their choreography. If that's the case, then you would need to figure out, do you have the hearing interpreter? Do you have shadow interpretation that's delivered? Do you have an ASLL? But if it's just those kind of top of house comments, just welcome, enjoy the show, then a hearing ASL English interpreter or regular interpretation would lend itself to that.
Thank you.
All right, so moving on. The next approach to interpretation is the ASL shadow performance. So let's say, for example, if during the choreography of that dance performance in your example, if it had voicing included, it might be good to use this approach. Generally, the deaf community prefers an ASL shadow performance. The reason for that is the ASL lead actually will stand next to or in the same space as the actors. So if you compare that with traditional interpreting number two, I play that visual ping pong. There are the four actors doing their actions on one part of the stage, and the interpreters are kind of off stage left or stage right. The shadow performance, as you see in the picture, you see the cowardly lion, and then almost right next to them is the interpreter. And the same for Dorothy. So each of the cast members will have their own designated interpreter, and they are delivering the content, the interpretation, right next to the character. And again, just like in number two, you also still have those interpreters seated in the front row who are feeding or cueing the ASL shadow interpreters. So when I'm working as an ASL shadow interpreter, am doing a little bit of the visual ping pong. Part is me taking in, seeing what my actor is doing so I can follow along accordingly, and taking in that information from the interpreter in the front row. This kind of approach is usually the best approach to use for deaf children, in my experience. And the reason for that is that it's very important to remember that deaf children are just in the beginning stages of using and learning how to use ASL when it's interpreted. So, in the same way that a child is just learning how to develop with spoken language, children are just learning how ASL as a language works. And so sometimes when it comes to accessibility, there are a lot of additional difficulties and considerations that impact deaf children. So imagine you have the deaf children who are looking one corner of the screen and then again bouncing back to the characters. They haven't learned how to do that yet. They don't know how to work with interpreters yet. And so that would be overwhelming for them. And when the kids are overwhelmed, they're then going to tune out. I've noticed that, and it can be quite hard even just to keep their attention in those traditional interpreting models. And of course, that's more difficult the younger the children are, naturally. Again, the director of ASL or the DASL will support that process as well and walk you through that. When it comes to shadow interpretation, you're able to see the actions and the sign language delivered at the same time and in the same space. You can just lock onto the characters. You don't have that additional cognitive or physical work of bouncing back and forth. You just lock in and pay attention. And it also provides the hearing and the deaf and non-deaf audiences the same experience at the same time. If you have the traditional approach to interpreting, it's really not the same experience because you have the interpreters off to the side, and a lot of the time we're left behind missing a lot of information. Shadow performances provides a better parallel where we're both getting the information at the same time. That is usually the preferred approach for the deaf community. And for that, I would suggest, 4 to 6 weeks lead time before the rehearsal. Again, it depends on the content. It depends on what the actual performance looks like. It depends on how many characters there are. It depends if they're minor characters versus major characters as well. Because in addition to the content, you also have to now figure out the blocking, the timing, and getting all of those cues together. So the interpreting team, just like the actors themselves, go through the rehearsals. The interpreters or the shadow performers also need to be involved in that rehearsal process too. Yes, Rachel.
So I have a question. In that case, would the shadow artist or shadow actor, if we're paying equity rates, do we pay those people equity rates also, or is there a higher fee because they're essentially doing more?
Great question. That's a great question. The actors, the artists, they would have the equity rates, so they would get the same as the actors' rates because in a sense they are also actors. When it comes to the interpreters, that's a little bit different. Again, the DASL, the director of ASL, would talk about and better advise you based on the specific project. This is maybe a little off topic, but sometimes you also do need to consider the budget. So, I don't know, some interpreters, if you're paying the interpreter seated in the front row, like $100 or $200 an hour, but you're only then paying the actors and the shadow actors $60 or $70 an hour, that could be problematic. So that's something else to consider. But in terms of the right or wrong answer, I don't think there is one clear right or wrong answer. I think it's more about transparency in the process and making sure everyone agrees and is on the same page. What I'm hearing from the deaf community is sometimes an interpreter, so the interpreter who would like be seated in the front row, providing the feeding, they are getting paid a lot more than the actual deaf actors or deaf shadow performers themselves. And so sometimes that seems a little bit unequitable because the hearing interpreters are getting paid more to use our language, even though it's our language. So, there's no right or wrong answer. But in terms of, let's say, interpreters working into other languages, spoken languages, or interpreters who are working with English, ASL, French, and Spanish, maybe in one performance, they, I do think, should get more work because they have additional competencies, so they should be paid fairly for that. Whereas if you have just the traditional interpreter just doing English to ASL, that's a different story. But again, for those specific questions, I'd refer you to the director of ASL because it sometimes can be project specific. My general recommendation, sometimes I hear that people find the fees for the hearing ASL interpreter is too expensive. And my answer to that would be, then don't hire them. You have options. If they're too expensive, you're allowed to do negotiations. You're allowed to request bids for service. You're allowed to request proposals, just like if you're not happy with the doctor you go to, you can look for a different doctor. It's the exact same. So I know sometimes people feel like they may be stuck. Oh, this is the rate of interpreters, period. But again, that's not always the case. And I think a lot of the questions in this process will be solved by making sure you have a really competent director of ASL from the get-go.
Thank you. That really, really gives me something to think about as I move forward with a bunch of different projects. I really appreciate that answer.
Yeah. Now, yeah, I could say more, but for now, let's move to the next part. So the fourth approach is really the gold standard when it comes to equity in theater. This is the top choice. This is ASL cast integration. Well, actually, before I go ahead, I'll just jump back to the shadow interpreting, the shadow performances again. So I know, Rachel, you and I have done quite a lot of work, especially with like Roseneath Theater, for example. I'm trying to think, ladies and gents, guys and doll. The interpreter's not sure of the specific name, but ladies and gentlemen, guys and dolls, right? Guys, girls and
Boys and
guys.
girls.
Thank you. But so in terms of the experience, that was a project that we had worked on where there was ASL shadow performance. And the audience, at least what I was getting from their feedback, was they loved it because not only is it more equitable and accessible, but it's also very rare that you see that kind of shadow performance. But especially because we were working with theater for young audiences, I think this was a really great choice. Adults, I mean, in terms of the community, you don't necessarily see it very often, and it isn't as critical. But when we're doing theater with young audiences, that is incredibly important. So when you're looking at a project, I think it's important to make sure that when we think about accessibility, it's not a kind of coverall, but we also really need to think of the question, who is the audience? Because it's not one size fits all. The interpretation that might work for an adult or older audience doesn't necessarily work for a younger audience. All right, so back to that gold standard, the ASL cast integration. So looking at this fourth option, this is my preference. This is my favorite approach because really, if you look at it, it is culturally relevant, it is culturally inclusive, and it also does a lot in terms of modeling accurate representation. This is the approach that you'll see a lot in the States, so especially on Broadway, for example. And I've had a chance to see Broadway shows with this approach done, and it is mind-blowing. Here, it can be a little bit difficult just because we don't have the same numbers in the deaf arts community in Canada or in Ontario, whereas in the States, there's a lot more to choose from. So you can actually do a better process where you have a deaf cast of 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 deaf actors, whereas here, we're a little bit behind. And then again, if you're looking for the audience, if it's an adult audience, if the characters are adult, then you need to make sure that you have deaf adults working, whereas deaf children working. So just here we have the smaller numbers, so it is a little bit challenging. If it's a performance that has smaller numbers, fewer characters, this can be a great approach. But if it's a larger cast size, it could be a little bit challenging. But in this here, again, using the example, this is not the Wizard of Oz, sorry. So the Wizard of Oz, in the example, you had the Cowardly Lion, the Scarecrow, Dorothy, and the Tin Man. Whereas using that example, instead of having those characters interpreted, you actually have the deaf actors delivering the lines in ASL on stage, and the hearing actors are seated in the front delivering the lines verbally. So you can kind of think of them as replacing those seats that the hearing interpreters would sit on in the other models. So instead of being interpreters, they're voice actors. Now, you might see people in the picture behind them. Sometimes there will be additional characters who are tapping on the shoulder, and those people are cueing the deaf actors. Again, in the same way that the director of ASL will provide the cueing, or you might have a director off stage providing cueing, that same approach happens in this ASL cast integration model. The voice actors already have all of the lines memorized. And so instead of doing the blocking, they just sit and deliver the lines and they let the deaf cast do their thing on the stage. That is such an incredible approach to theater. It is amazing. I really can't stress it enough. And it's a benefit for the deaf audiences, clearly, and the non-deaf audiences, because even those non-deaf audiences, even if they're not understanding the ASL, they still take in all of the movement. Now, in terms of for that, I'd say that's usually 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes it could be up to 8 weeks before because again, just like you would with any other cast, you need to make sure that they have an opportunity to prepare. You're also working with kind of retraining those actors where they're transitioning from the stage to the seats, figuring out how to be comfortable working with the interpreters, figuring out how to be comfortable with having these cues for the voice actors to deliver their lines. And at the same time, you have the deaf actors who are working on studying their lines and making sure that they are ready for the stage. So there are a lot of moving parts. And because of that, it requires a lot of additional lead-in time. And then let's say 2 to 3 weeks beforehand is when you start doing those tech rehearsals where you have the voice actors in the seats, the deaf cast on the stage, and they're delivering and getting feedback on the cueing. Again, depending on the length of the project, sorry, interpreter error, depending on how complicated the piece is, you may need to have a longer lead in time. But again, the director of ASL would provide feedback on that. So, okay, we're all good so far? We're all on the same page? Okay, so I'm going to go back. So jumping back up now to discuss the costs of these different options. Usually, if you want to think of it reasonable, and when I say reasonable, I mean cheap, that means number one is the cheapest option, increasing gradually, where number four, the cast integration, is the most expensive option. A lot of issues when it comes to having ASL cast integration, almost all of the problems that I've heard or all of the feedback that I've had is that it's difficult in order to have it be in the budget. So even though it's the dream, it's the gold standard, it sometimes is difficult. And a lot of the time when people receive a no for this approach, I understand that it is difficult because in a way you're paying for double the cast size, the ASL, the deaf actors, the hearing actors, and also the interpreters, the accessibility team. So that can be quite limiting. A lot of directors, as soon as they hear the cost, they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Some people will then instead do the shadow performance. It saves a little bit of money, but you get most of the same information. Sometimes that's financially feasible. But again, there's a low chance of getting that because of the costs. The most popular is number two. So you'll have the actors delivering their content on the stage, and you'll have the interpreters off to the side. And the reason is in terms of the timing, you can get it done within 3 to 4 weeks. It's usually more budget friendly. And again, when I say budget friendly, means cheap. So overall, all of these different options do have their different costs and their pros and cons, but um, that's that. Sorry, I'm just looking at a few other screens. So was there a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, Rachel.
Well, actually, it's more of a comment. I wanted to go back to talking about ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, where we had three hearing actors, three deaf actors, and we did the shadow interpretation. One, fantastic process, really great learning process for me. So thank you for that. And two, the feedback that I received from the hearing audience was that they also loved the shadow interpretation, that seeing the deaf actors' movements as well as ASL and facial expressions and all of the beauty of your language added something for the hearing audience as well. So I think that's not the focus, but it was a really nice benefit that we heard of from the audience. So I just wanted to sort of say that to anyone who's considering it, there's benefits for every audience member that providing this equitable way of presenting and making sure that the deaf community is really welcomed in and included is beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, for sure. And that's exactly right. I mean, I'm even remember again coming back to that question, who is the audience? So in that audience, most of it was a younger audience. And so being there, just seeing the look on the audience's faces, just as they took everything in, you just saw the connection. And so when you see not only the final product, but also just seeing what it looks like to have people fully getting accessibility. I know there are a few questions. So one is, why is it important to have deaf artists involved when you are offering ASL performances? I mean, really, there are two different kind of worlds. There's the deaf world, and then there's the hearing world. We are in our own world, and right now they exist as two different worlds. We have our own culture, our own language, our own community. And not a lot of hearing individuals actually realize that. A lot of people don't understand that we have our own culture. And I know it's because the numbers are small and we can be kind of invisible or overlooked. And we're overlooked quite a lot. And so, because of that, I think it's really important to pull the deaf community into some of those spaces so that we can have the respect that we deserve. And again, it also encourages people to recognize us and not just leave us behind. It's this invitation to be like, no, come and join us where we are. And again, it's important keeping the respect there. And I think that's done through providing accessibility. So it's really important that that gets done. All right, so the next question, what are some of the positive experiences working with mostly a hearing cast or creative team, bringing ASL and diff interpretation? I mean, again, in my experience, there are two that stand out because the benefits go both ways. So I know that the hearing audience learns a lot from me in terms of working with interpreters and learning from the deaf cast, but we also benefit because we're learning from the professional experience of those actors. So
Mhm.
it's this mutual exchange. When we work together, both parties benefit. The deaf folks working, providing accessibility also benefit in their own professional lives. A lot of deaf artists don't have programs that are accessible to them when it comes to learning theater, even just something as simple as like Theater 101. That might exist for folks in the non-deaf world, but it's often not accessible for us. And so part of what I do in my work with Dancing Hands is to make sure that these presentations and to make sure that these workshops are accessible, but also to provide the training to other individuals so that they know how to work with hearing and deaf actors. So it isn't just the hearing cast or production benefiting, but it's also the deaf cast benefiting as well. And that experience of being limited or not having accessible options is even worse for the younger deaf community. A lot of the time, they have to wait until they're older to have those experiences that are accessible. And again, I know we're a small group, and sometimes that is part of the challenge. But again, even though we're small, we still need that uplifting. I'm just doing a time check. Oh, it's almost 7:50. Okay. We'll move fast. What do hearing folks need to know to support deaf artists in their smaller communities? I mean, again, when working in the theater space, whether that's as a director or in terms of accessibility or an accessibility director, I know there are so many different roles. It's important to keep ASL at the front of mind. And for the best interpreter error, going to reinterpret that, and for to make sure that it is delivered in the best way possible, you're going to want to have a director of ASL. Sometimes people say, "Oh, I know someone who signs, I'll reach out to them." And so that person gets reached out to, but I mean, that person might be your grandmother, and maybe they're not the best person to have. That might not be the best approach. So when it comes to these kind of things, it's important not to minimize ASL or, oh, it's nothing. I can just get ASL from reading a book. Like, no, it's not. That's not the case. And so I think it's important if you want to include deaf artists and make a space for us, it's important to recognize that. And so we do have different experiences. And so it's important to listen to our experiences, be listening to our needs, and then be willing to accommodate them. All right. How can rural arts communities or rural arts companies reach out to their local deaf community and ensure that they're welcome in these spaces? That's a huge question. I'm just so when it comes to my view of being a creative caretaker, I mean, there are so many different roles that can happen and so many things to navigate. Sometimes you can recognize or reach out to those people who maybe have experience. You can also look at social media, whether that's Facebook or Instagram or whatever platform, reach out to people there and provide the information there. Let them know that this show is happening, make sure that the community is aware of what's happening. But again, like I said earlier, that question can be answered by having the director of ASL. They can do a short video, so a vlog of sorts, where they're delivering all of the information in ASL, because that will help the theater communities spread the word within the deaf channels. And then the deaf community will also do some natural networking themselves. Now, what I've often seen, sometimes a theater performance will host an accessible performance. It has interpretation, but nobody shows up. No deaf community members show up. And I think that really is just proof that the deaf community is not only in Toronto, the deaf community exists all around Ontario. And so it's important to think about their travel time. If they are driving to a show in Toronto, are they going to do it? I mean, okay, there might be a couple of deaf folks who live in Toronto, but for most of us who live outside of the city proper, we're not going to make it. Now, I know theater itself is also starting to spread, and we're seeing things happen in other communities instead of being so Toronto-centric, but that is still something important to keep in mind. And then especially theater for young audiences, theater for deaf children, they're not living in Toronto. And so that's important to remember. Again, the best person to connect with would be the director of ASL because they're going to guide you through the process. They're going to provide you that support. Instead of saying, I don't know what I'm doing, I have no idea what I'm doing, that's great. You don't have to because there's the director of ASL who knows what they're doing and can support you through that whole journey. All right. And then the last question here, if you had the top three things that rural arts companies can do to ensure access. Again, the director of ASL. I sound like a broken record, but the director of ASL is number one, 100%. And the reason is that, I mean, at least from my experience, sometimes it might be that I know someone or there's an interpreter that a theater's worked with in the past, and it's been the same interpreter for many years, and they're the go-to, and they kind of have a pigeonhole on that particular theater. And sometimes that leads to a problem where hearing interpreters, non-deaf interpreters, gatekeep these spaces and actually can be the reason that deaf community members don't have the access to the information or the access to those spaces. When it comes to the budget, I know budgets are not always predictable. We are relying on grants, we're relying on sponsorship, we're relying on the Canadian Council for the Arts and the Ontario Arts Council. And so there are so many things out there, so many sources we're trying to use. What I'm trying to do with my part, I'm working with the CCA, so the Canadian Council for the Arts, in terms of the grant applications. They've just revamped their system. So they have about applying for workshops. So I'm working on that so that we're able to hire and provide more mentorship through that funding. So that's one idea. That could be a mechanism through which you hire the director of ASL. And again, that can provide more exposure. And who knows, maybe the theater may benefit through some grants if they write one specifically for deaf artists to kind of work with your theater team, whether that's your cast or the executive, because CCA does have accessibility budgets apart from funding you would receive to deliver the actual programming of your grant. So I know that's a thing. But again, when it's working in tandem, having this collaborative partnership between deaf actors and hearing actors, that could be gold for a grant application if they're working together on a joint project. So I'd say that.
Mhm.
um, I don't know. I know we have a few minutes left, but yep, if
I have a question.
yeah.
Yep. Okay. So I'd like to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is about gatekeeping. And I wanted you to talk actually, because I'm not sure if everybody knows about culturally appropriate interpreters or finding the interpreter that your deaf artist wants or can work with. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that for a little bit.
So when it comes to hiring an accessibility team, I think it's important to make sure that the deaf actors or artists have the ability to work with you through that process when it comes to selecting the access team. When it comes to interpretation, some interpreters are only in the profession for the money. And so sometimes interpreters also, because they are also hearing, will prevent an opening of options. I think sometimes it's, oh, well, here's this interpreter. We already know an interpreter. We're going to use them. But just like any other profession, there are some interpreters who are ethical and competent and good, and some who are not. Sometimes we as the deaf community, what we actually experience often is there are a lot of interpreters who will actually go against what we as a community are saying, or sometimes the interpreter's already been hired first. And so the interpreter works directly for the theater, but we don't know and you're provide I mean it's complicated. They're there to provide accommodations for the deaf community, provide accessibility for the deaf community. But so I would say it's incredibly important to work with a deaf community member and make sure there's transparency in terms of the boundaries of an interpreter, what the budget is for that to make sure it's fair and equitable, and have that deaf individual along the way in the process to make sure that it's fair and equitable.
Thank you. We have Ian here, and I'm wondering if Ian might have any questions, or perhaps they might be holding space. I'm not sure. Hmm. Okay.
If I could just add, I mean, another thing to think about as well is when it comes to working with other deaf artists and their projects and their developing ideas, it's important as non-deaf theaters and non-deaf theater workers to provide opportunities for them. Sometimes they don't know where to start. They have an idea, but they don't know where to go with it. And so it's important to encourage them, reach out to them. That's something I do quite often, but make sure that you are providing an opportunity for them to have space, whether that's participating in a festival. Sometimes they're afraid to apply to a festival. They don't think it's for them. They think it's only for non-deaf people. So it's important to make sure that they're encouraged and welcomed in those processes too, because we really want to have deaf artists more involved so that that specific subset of the community can grow.
That's amazing. Thank you, Juan. You've given us so much information today, and I'm really hopeful that the folks that are viewing this recording or here tonight feel a lot more confident in reaching out to deaf artists and to starting that process of offering opportunities to work together, and also having the opportunity to work with a new group of amazing artists that they might not have worked with before. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time, especially when you're moving, to spend with us this evening, and looking forward to chatting with you more in the future. So I will end our recording now, if that's okay. And I'm just going to stop that right now.